The blood on Beatrice Jensen's hands was not her own, and that was the problem she could not talk her way out of, no matter how silver her tongue had been back in Philadelphia. She stood in the middle of a dusty canyon road, somewhere between Marysvale, Utah, and nowhere, surrounded by 6 men with guns drawn, their faces hidden behind bandanas stained with trail dust and worse things. The stagecoach she had been riding in lay on its side 20 feet behind her, one wheel still spinning lazily in the hot September air of 1882. And the driver who had promised her safe passage to California was dead in the dirt with his eyes staring at a sky that offered no answers. "Well now," the tallest of the outlaws said, his voice carrying a drawl that might have been charming under different circumstances. "Looks like we got ourselves a witness." Beatrice raised her chin, refusing to let her hands shake despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I did not see your faces." "That is not entirely true, though, is it?" Another man stepped forward, this one broader in the shoulders, with eyes that gleamed with something cruel above his bandana. "You were looking right at us when Jake here put that driver down." She had been. God help her. She had been watching through the stagecoach window when they had ambushed the coach, when the driver had reached for his rifle, when the bullet had torn through his chest before he could even get the weapon raised. She had watched it all with the kind of horrified fascination that comes when the world you thought you knew reveals itself to be far more savage than you had ever imagined. "I am just a schoolteacher," Beatrice said, which was not precisely a lie, though it was not precisely the truth either. "I have no quarrel with you. Let me walk away, and I will tell no one what happened here." The tall one laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. "A schoolteacher traveling alone across Utah territory? That is a peculiar thing, is it not?" "I have business in California." "What kind of business?" "The private kind." That earned her another laugh, this one joined by several of his companions. The broad-shouldered one took another step closer, and Beatrice could smell the whiskey on him, even from several feet away. "Maybe we should take her back to the hideout. Let Cutter decide what to do with her." "Cutter said no witnesses," a third man interjected, his voice younger, more nervous. "Cutter also said nothing about pretty school teachers with fire in their eyes." Before Beatrice could formulate a response to that, before she could decide whether to run or beg or fight with the small derringer hidden in her boot, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. The outlaws turned as one, their guns swinging toward the source of the sound, and Beatrice saw her chance. She dove behind the overturned stagecoach just as the first shots rang out. The next 30 seconds were chaos. Gunfire cracked and echoed, men shouted, horses screamed. Beatrice pressed herself against the stagecoach's undercarriage, her hands over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. She heard bodies hitting the ground, heard the thunder of retreating horses, heard silence descend like a curtain. Then a voice, rough and slightly out of breath, spoke from somewhere above her. "You can come out now. They are gone." Beatrice opened her eyes and found herself looking at a pair of dusty boots, spurs glinting in the afternoon sun. She followed the boots up to long legs clad in worn denim, a gun belt slung low on narrow hips, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up over tanned forearms, and finally a face that made her breath catch in her throat, despite everything she had just witnessed. He was young, probably not more than 25, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck and eyes the color of storm clouds. A badge was pinned to his chest, though it was so tarnished she could barely make out the words Deputy Marshal etched into the silver. "Are you hurt?" he asked, extending a hand to help her up. Beatrice took his hand, surprised by the calluses on his palm, by the strength in his grip as he pulled her to her feet. "No, I am not hurt." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in her traveling dress, now covered in dust and torn at the hem, the loose strands of honey-blonde hair that had escaped from her careful bun, the way she held herself, despite the terror that still coursed through her veins. "You are Beatrice Jensen." It was not a question, and that sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the desert wind. "How do you know my name?" "Because I have been tracking those men for 3 weeks, and I have been tracking you for 5 days. He released her hand and took a step back, his expression unreadable. "My name is Ethan Dalton. I am a deputy marshal out of Salt Lake City, and I need you to tell me everything you know about the Cutter gang." "I do not know anything about any gang. I was simply traveling to California when those men attacked the stagecoach." That is interesting, because according to my information, you are supposed to be dead. Ethan pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it up for her to see. It was a wanted poster, and the face drawn on it was unmistakably hers, albeit with darker hair and harder eyes. Beatrice Jensen, wanted for murder in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, $500 reward, dead or alive. The world tilted slightly beneath Beatrice's feet, and she reached out to steady herself against the stagecoach. That is not true. I did not kill anyone. Then why did you run? Because no one would have believed me. The words came out sharper than she had intended, edged with all the fear and anger and desperation she had carried with her across half the country. My employer was found dead in his study with my letter opener in his chest, and I was the only person in the house. What was I supposed to do? Wait around for them to hang me for a crime I did not commit? Ethan studied her for another long moment, and Beatrice could not read the expression on his face. Finally, he folded the poster and tucked it back into his pocket. The Cutter Gang has been terrorizing this territory for months. Robbery, murder, kidnapping. They have a hideout somewhere in these canyons, but no one has been able to find it. Those men who attacked your stagecoach, they were part of that gang. What does that have to do with me? Because they did not kill you, Ethan said simply. They killed your driver without hesitation, but they were talking about taking you back to their hideout. That means they wanted you alive for some reason, which means you might be valuable to them, which means you might be valuable to me. Beatrice felt her temper flare, hot and bright. I am not bait for your trap, Marshal. Deputy Marshal, he corrected, and there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. And I am not suggesting you be bait. I am suggesting that we might be able to help each other. You want to clear your name and get to California without being arrested or killed. I want to bring down the Cutter Gang and make this territory safe again. We both need the same thing right now, which is to stay alive long enough to see tomorrow. What are you proposing? Those men are going to come back, Ethan said, glancing back down the canyon road. When they do, they are going to be looking for you. If they find you alone, you are dead, or worse. If they find you with a deputy marshal, we are both dead. But if they find you in Marysvale, appearing to be just another woman trying to make her way in the territory, they might approach you again. And when they do, I will be watching. You want me to pretend to be an easy target. I want you to pretend to be exactly what you said you were. A schoolteacher with business in California, temporarily delayed in a small Utah town. Ethan's expression grew serious. I will not lie to you, Miss Jensen. This is dangerous, but you are already in danger, wanted poster or not. At least this way, you have someone watching your back. Beatrice looked at the dead driver, at the overturned stagecoach, at the blood soaking into the thirsty desert earth. She thought about Philadelphia, about the man who had died in his study, about the real killer who was still walking free while she ran for her life. She thought about California, about the new start she had been promised, about the sister she had not seen in 7 years who was waiting for her in San Francisco. She looked back at Ethan Dalton, at his storm cloud eyes and his tarnished badge, and she made a choice that would change everything. What do I need to do? The ride into Marysvale took 2 hours on the back of Ethan's horse, a sturdy bay gelding with a patient disposition and a ground-eating trot. Beatrice rode behind the saddle, her arms wrapped around Ethan's waist, feeling the heat of him through his shirt, and trying not to think about how long it had been since she had been this close to another human being. He smelled like leather and sage and something else, something clean and masculine that made her head spin, in a way that had nothing to do with the desert sun. They did not speak much during the ride. Ethan was focused on their surroundings, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip, his eyes constantly scanning the rocky terrain for signs of the outlaws. Beatrice was focused on staying on the horse and not thinking about what she had agreed to do. Marysvale was smaller than she had expected, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a main street that seemed to exist more out of stubbornness than any real purpose. There was a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a small church with a white steeple, and a boarding house that looked like it had seen better days about 20 years ago. The mountains rose up behind the town, red and gold in the fading afternoon light, beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Ethan pulled his horse to a stop in front of the boarding house and dismounted, then offered his hand to help Beatrice down. Her legs were shaky after the long ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground. Ethan caught her elbow, steadying her, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "The woman who runs this place is named Martha Calloway," he said quietly. "She is a widow, honest, and she can keep a secret. I will tell her you are a friend in need of a place to stay for a few days. She will not ask questions. What will you tell her about the stagecoach? About the driver?" "The truth, more or less. That there was an attack, that you were the only survivor, that I brought you here for your own safety." He released her elbow and took a step back, putting a proper distance between them. "But I will not mention the wanted poster, and I will not mention what we are really doing here. As far as anyone in this town knows, you are exactly what you appear to be." The door to the boarding house opened before Beatrice could respond, and a woman emerged onto the porch. She was in her 50s, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that were sharp but not unkind. She took in Beatrice's disheveled appearance with a single glance, then turned her attention to Ethan. "Deputy Dalton," she said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelty to be surprised by any of it. "What have you brought me this time?" "A friend who needs help, Mrs. Calloway. The eastbound stage was attacked about 10 miles out. She was the only survivor." Martha Calloway's expression softened slightly, and she descended the porch steps to stand in front of Beatrice. "You poor dear, come inside and let me get you cleaned up and fed. You look like you have been through hell itself." "I do not have much money," Beatrice said, because it was true. The small stash of coins she had brought from Philadelphia would not last long at boarding house rates. "We will work something out," Martha said firmly. "I can always use help with the washing and the cooking. We will call it an even trade for room and board. Come along now." Beatrice glanced back at Ethan, suddenly uncertain about leaving his protection, about stepping into this new role he had created for her. He nodded once, a small gesture of reassurance, and she felt something settle in her chest. She followed Martha Calloway into the boarding house, leaving Ethan standing in the street with his horse and his tarnished badge and his plans for catching outlaws. The room Martha showed her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the mountains. There was a pitcher of water and a basin, a clean towel, and a bar of soap that smelled like lavender. After Martha left her alone with promises of supper in an hour, Beatrice sank down onto the bed and let herself shake. She had killed a man in Philadelphia. That part of the story was true, even if the wanted poster had gotten the details wrong. But he had not been her employer, and it had not been murder. It had been self-defense, desperate and messy and horrible. Jonathan Blackwell had tried to force himself on her one night after dismissing the other servants. And when she had fought back, when she had grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, when the letter opener had sunk into his chest, she had watched the surprise bloom in his eyes right before he died. She had run because she knew how the law worked. Women like her, women without family or money or influence, did not win against men like Jonathan Blackwell, even when those men were dead. So, she had taken what little money she could find, had bought a ticket west, had written to her sister in San Francisco to say she was coming. And now she was here, in this small Utah town, surrounded by outlaws and playing a dangerous game with a deputy marshal who had every reason to arrest her and no reason to trust her. Except, he had not arrested her. He had saved her life instead, and then he had asked for her help. And there had been something in his eyes when he looked at her that made her want to believe she was more than just a murderer on the run. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Supper is ready, dear," Martha called through the wood. Beatrice washed her face and hands, smoothed her hair as best she could, and went downstairs to face whatever came next. The dining room held a long table surrounded by mismatched chairs, and there were 3 other boarders already seated when Beatrice entered. 2 were miners, gruff and weathered, who nodded at her politely before returning their attention to their food. The 3rd was a young woman about Beatrice's age, with dark hair and curious eyes, who smiled brightly as Beatrice took the empty seat beside her. "You must be the survivor from the stage attack," the young woman said, her voice warm with sympathy. How absolutely terrifying that must have been. "I am Claire Henderson. My father owns the general store, but I help Mrs. Calloway here in the evenings." "Beatrice Jensen," Beatrice replied, accepting the bowl of stew that Martha passed her way. "And yes, it was quite terrifying. Were there many bandits? Did they steal everything? Was Deputy Dalton very heroic when he rescued you? Claire leaned forward, her eyes alight with the kind of romantic notions that came from reading too many dime novels. "Claire, let the poor woman eat her supper before you interrogate her," Martha said, but there was affection in her voice. Claire made a face but subsided, and the meal continued with more mundane conversation about the weather and the mining operations and the upcoming church social. Beatrice ate mechanically, the stew warming her from the inside out, and tried not to think about the fact that somewhere out in those mountains, the Cutter gang was planning their next move, and she was the piece on the chessboard they did not know Ethan Dalton had played. After supper, Claire insisted on showing Beatrice around the boarding house, chattering the entire time about the town's inhabitants and their various quirks and scandals. It was during this tour that Beatrice learned that Ethan Dalton had been in Marysvale for almost 2 months, that he took his meals at the saloon and slept in a room above the livery stable, and that he was considered quite handsome by every unmarried woman in town, though he had never shown interest in any of them. "He is very dedicated to his work," Claire said with a sigh, "always tracking bandits or investigating robberies. It is all very noble, but a bit sad, do not you think? Everyone needs companionship." "Perhaps he prefers solitude," Beatrice offered, though she found herself wondering about Ethan Dalton's life beyond the badge and the gun. "Or perhaps he just has not met the right woman yet," Claire said with a knowing look that made Beatrice's cheeks flush. That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Utah night, Beatrice thought about Philadelphia and California and the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the driver who had died protecting a stagecoach full of mail and luggage. She thought about the outlaws who wanted her for reasons she did not understand. And she thought about Ethan Dalton, with his storm cloud eyes and his quiet competence, who had looked at her wanted poster and decided to trust her anyway. She did not sleep well, and when the sun rose over the mountains the next morning, she felt like she had lived a dozen lifetimes in the span of a single night. The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. Beatrice helped Martha with the washing and the cooking, learning the rhythms of the boarding house and the town. She met more of Marysvale's residents, the shopkeepers and the miners and the ranch hands who came into town on their days off. She attended church on Sunday with Martha and Claire, sitting in a pew near the back and trying not to feel like a fraud when the minister spoke about redemption and forgiveness. And she saw Ethan Dalton, though never alone and never for long. He would tip his hat to her when they passed on the street, would exchange pleasantries about the weather or her adjustment to town life, would move on before anyone could remark on them speaking. But there was always a moment, just before he walked away, when his eyes would meet hers and she would see the question there. "Are you all right? Are you safe? Are you ready?" She tried to answer with her own gaze. Yes, I do not know." On the 4th day, a stranger rode into town. Beatrice was hanging laundry behind the boarding house when she heard the horse, heard the jingle of spurs as the rider dismounted somewhere on the main street. Something about the sound made her pause, made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in warning. She moved to the corner of the building, careful to stay out of sight, and peered around to see who had arrived. The man was tall and lean, dressed in black from his hat to his boots, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the hardness in his eyes and the cruel set of his mouth. He was standing in front of the saloon, scanning the street with the kind of attention that spoke of a man looking for something specific, or someone. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him from the canyon, from the stagecoach attack. He was the one who had wanted to take her back to the hideout, the one with the broad shoulders and the whiskey breath. And now he was here, in Marysvale, looking for her. She pulled back from the corner and pressed herself against the boarding house wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She needed to find Ethan. She needed to warn him that the outlaws had returned. She needed to not panic, which was becoming harder with each passing second. "Beatrice, are you all right?" Claire appeared from the kitchen door, her arms full of linens, her expression concerned. "I am fine," Beatrice managed, though her voice came out strained. "I just thought I saw someone I recognized." "From Philadelphia?" Claire's eyes lit up with interest. "No, from the stagecoach attack." That changed everything. Claire dropped the linens and grabbed Beatrice's arm, pulling her back toward the kitchen door. "Get inside, right now. I will find Deputy Dalton." "Claire, you do not need to—" "Inside," Claire repeated, and there was steel beneath her usual cheerfulness. Mrs. Calloway did not raise me to be useless in a crisis. Go." Beatrice went, slipping back into the kitchen and moving to the front room where she could watch the street through the lace curtains without being easily seen. She watched Claire hurry down the street toward the livery stable, watched the stranger in black enter the saloon, watched the normal flow of town life continue around these 2 points of danger as if nothing were wrong. 5 minutes later, Ethan emerged from the livery stable with Claire beside him. They spoke briefly, Claire gesturing back toward the boarding house, Ethan's expression hardening as he listened. Then he nodded once, touched Claire's shoulder in what looked like gratitude, and walked toward the saloon with his hand resting casually on his revolver. Beatrice held her breath, waiting for gunfire, for shouting, for violence. But none came. Instead, Ethan disappeared into the saloon, and the afternoon continued its slow crawl toward evening. Martha found Beatrice at the window 20 minutes later, still watching, still waiting. The older woman did not ask questions. She simply pulled a chair over beside Beatrice and sat down, her presence solid and reassuring. "He is good at his job," Martha said quietly. "Deputy Dalton, I mean. He will handle this." "How do you know?" "Because he has been handling things like this since he was 17 years old, when his father was killed by bandits and he decided to become a lawman instead of a rancher." Martha's voice was matter of fact, but there was sympathy in it. "He carries a lot of responsibility on those young shoulders, and he does not let himself fail if he can help it." "What if he cannot help it this time? Then we will deal with what comes, but I have learned over the years that borrowing trouble from tomorrow just ruins today." Martha patted Beatrice's hand. "You care about him." It was not a question, and Beatrice found she could not deny it. In 4 days, Ethan Dalton had become more than just the deputy marshal who had saved her life. He had become the person she looked for in every crowd, the thought that followed her into sleep, the reason she checked her reflection in the washstand mirror each morning. It was ridiculous and dangerous and entirely inappropriate given the circumstances, but it was also undeniably true. "I barely know him," she said, instead of answering directly. "Sometimes that does not matter," Martha replied. "Sometimes you just know." The sun was setting when Ethan finally left the saloon, the stranger in black walking beside him. They stood together in the street for a moment, their body language suggesting a tense conversation, and then the stranger swung back up onto his horse and rode out of town the way he had come. Ethan watched him go, his hand still on his revolver, and did not move until the rider had disappeared into the gathering dusk. Then he turned and walked directly to the boarding house. Martha answered his knock, ushering him into the parlor where Beatrice still waited. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been that morning, but he also looked satisfied in a grim sort of way. "His name is Jackson Pierce," Ethan said without preamble. "He was asking around town about a woman matching your description, saying his sister had been on the eastbound stage and he was trying to find out if she survived the attack. I told him there had been a survivor, but that she had already left town, headed north towards Salt Lake City." "Did he believe you?" Beatrice asked. "I do not know, but he left, which means either he believed me or he is going back to report to the rest of the gang. Either way, we do not have much time." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that made him look younger and more vulnerable than the badge suggested. "They want you for something, Miss Jensen, and I need to figure out what before they come back in force." "I have been thinking about that," Beatrice said slowly. "When they attacked the stagecoach, one of them said something about me being valuable to Cutter. Not as a witness, not as a hostage, but specifically valuable. What if they know who I really am? What if they know about the wanted poster?" Ethan frowned. Why would Outlaws care about a woman wanted for murder in Philadelphia? What if Jonathan Blackwell was connected to them somehow? What if his death disrupted something they were planning, and now they think I have information or money or something else they need? It was a leap of logic, a desperate grasp at explanation, but it made a certain horrible sense. Jonathan Blackwell had been wealthy, well-connected, and secretive about his business dealings. Beatrice had worked in his household for 2 years and never fully understood where his money came from, or why men with hard eyes and harder voices came to visit him at odd hours. "That would explain why they have not just killed you outright," Ethan said thoughtfully. "But it opens up a whole other set of problems. If the Cutter gang has connections back east, if they are part of something bigger than just local outlawry, then this is more complicated than I thought. What do we do now?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. something that made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Now we changed the plan. If Jackson Pierce believed my story, he will be watching the roads north. If he did not, he will be watching this town. Either way, we need to move you somewhere safer until I can get more information. Where would be safer than here? My family's ranch. It is about 15 miles west of here, up in the foothills. My brother still runs it, and he owes me more favors than I can count. Ethan's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Plus, it is isolated enough that no one can approach without being seen for miles. You would be safe there while I finish tracking the Cutter gang. I thought I was supposed to be bait, Beatrice pointed out. That was before Jackson Pierce showed up asking questions. That was before I realized how badly they want you. Ethan took a step closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I am not risking your life on a gamble, Miss Jensen, not when there are other options. You barely know me, she said, echoing her earlier words to Martha. I could be exactly what that wanted poster says I am. I could be a murderer and a liar, and you could be throwing away your career to protect me. Are you? Ethan asked quietly. Are you a murderer? Beatrice thought about Jonathan Blackwell dying on his study floor, about the weight of the letter opener in her hand, about the blood that had spread across the expensive carpet like a terrible flower blooming. I killed a man who was trying to rape me. I do not know if that makes me a murderer in the eyes of the law, but it makes me a survivor in my own. The silence that followed was heavy with all the things neither of them knew how to say. Then Ethan nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. We leave at dawn, pack light, and be ready to ride. He left before she could respond, before she could ask what happened next, before she could tell him that, somewhere in the last 4 days, she had started to trust him in a way she had not trusted anyone since her sister left for California 7 years ago. Martha cleared her throat from the doorway, reminding Beatrice that they were not alone, that this conversation would be all over town by morning if they were not careful. But the older woman's expression was knowing rather than judgmental, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. You should get some rest, dear. Dawn comes early, and if you are going to the Dalton Ranch, you will need your strength. Beatrice did try to rest, but sleep remained elusive. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the town settle into night, and she thought about Ethan Dalton and his tarnished badge and the way he had looked at her when she told him the truth about Philadelphia. She thought about the choice she had made 4 days ago in that canyon, and the choices that lay ahead of her now. And she thought about the fact that somewhere out in the darkness, the Cutter gang was planning their next move, and she was at the center of it all, whether she wanted to be or not. Dawn arrived cold and clear, the sky turning from black to indigo to pale gold as the sun climbed over the mountains. Beatrice, dressed in her most practical clothes, packed what few belongings she had into a canvas bag Martha provided, and came downstairs to find Ethan waiting in the kitchen with 2 horses saddled and a rifle slung across his back. Ready? He asked, and she nodded, even though she was not sure she would ever be ready for any of this. They left Marysvale as the town was waking up, riding west on a narrow trail that climbed steadily into the foothills. Beatrice rode her own horse this time, a gentle mare that Ethan had borrowed from the livery stable, and she was grateful for the independence even as she missed the closeness of riding behind him. They did not speak much during the ride, both of them focused on the terrain and the possibility of ambush, but there was a companionship in the shared silence that felt more intimate than words. The Dalton Ranch appeared as they crested a ridge, a collection of sturdy buildings nestled in a valley between 2 hills. There was a main house built from logs and stone, a barn that had been recently painted, corrals holding horses and cattle, and a sense of permanence that spoke of generations of care. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and as they rode closer, a man emerged onto the porch. He was taller than Ethan and broader through the shoulders, with the same dark hair and storm cloud eyes. But where Ethan's face held wariness and responsibility, this man's face held something lighter, something more at peace with the world. He watched them approach with his arms crossed over his chest, and when they were close enough, he called out in a voice rich with amusement. "Little brother brings home a stray. Ma would be so proud." "Shut up, Daniel," Ethan replied, but there was affection in it. He dismounted and helped Beatrice down from her mare, his hands steady on her waist. "This is Beatrice Jensen. She needs a safe place to stay for a few days while I finish some business in Marysvale." Daniel Dalton came down from the porch, his eyes taking in Beatrice with a kind of frank assessment that would have been rude from anyone else, but somehow seemed merely curious from him. Any particular reason she needs to be safe, or are we just being neighborly? The Cutter Gang wants her. That changed Daniel's expression from amused to serious in an instant. Hell, all right, she can stay as long as she needs, but you better finish this business quick, Ethan. I do not want trouble coming to my door if I can help it. That is why I brought her here instead of leaving her in town. No one knows about this place except me and a few old friends. Ethan turned to Beatrice, and his expression softened slightly. Daniel will take care of you. He is a pain in the neck. But he is good people. I am standing right here, Daniel protested. I know. Ethan touched Beatrice's elbow, the gesture brief but full of reassurance. I will be back as soon as I can. Stay close to the house, and if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you get Daniel, and you both find somewhere to hide. Understood? Beatrice wanted to tell him to be careful, wanted to ask him not to go, wanted to do a dozen things that would have been entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. Instead, she nodded and said, Understood. She watched him ride back down the trail until he disappeared over the ridge, and then she turned to find Daniel watching her with knowing eyes. He likes you, Daniel said, as if commenting on the weather. He is protecting me because it is his job. Ethan does a lot of things because they are his job, but he does not usually look at those things the way he looks at you. Daniel gestured toward the house. Come on, I will introduce you to my wife, and we can figure out where to put you that is not the barn. Daniel's wife was named Sarah, and she was a warm, practical woman with red hair and capable hands who took one look at Beatrice and declared her in need of a proper meal and a hot bath. Within an hour, Beatrice found herself sitting at the Dalton family table, eating fresh bread and stew, listening to Daniel and Sarah talk about ranch business and upcoming cattle drives, feeling more at home than she had felt in years. The next 2 days passed in a strange kind of peace. Beatrice helped Sarah with the household chores, learning the rhythms of ranch life, and finding a peculiar comfort in the physical work. She collected eggs from the chickens, helped with the washing, worked in the kitchen garden that Sarah tended with fierce pride. In the evenings, she sat with Daniel and Sarah on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains and tried not to think about Ethan back in Marysvale facing the Cutter Gang alone. But she did think about him. She thought about him constantly, in fact. She thought about the way his eyes had softened when she told him the truth about Philadelphia, about the strength in his hands when he helped her down from the horse, about the quiet competence with which he had faced Jackson Pierce in the saloon. She thought about the life he had chosen, carrying a badge and chasing outlaws, and the life he had left behind here on this ranch, where his family had built something lasting. On the third day, Sarah found Beatrice sitting on the porch long after sunset, staring at the trail that led back to Marysvale. He will be all right, Sarah said, settling into the chair beside her. Ethan knows what he is doing. Everyone keeps telling me that. It is true. He has been doing this work for 8 years now, ever since their father died. He was only 17, but he was determined to make sure no other families lost their fathers the way he and Daniel did. Sarah's voice was soft with sympathy. It nearly broke Daniel's heart when Ethan left the ranch to become a lawman, but he understood it too. Some people are built to stay in one place and build a life. Others are built to move through the world trying to fix what is broken. What if the world is too broken to fix? Then at least he will have tried. Sarah reached over and patted Beatrice's hand. And at least he will have someone waiting for him to come home, if you are willing to wait. Beatrice looked at Sarah in surprise, and the other woman smiled. You are not the first person to fall for Ethan Dalton, but I have a feeling you might be the first person he falls for in return. The way he looked at you when you arrived, that was not just a lawman protecting a witness. That was a man who had found something precious and was determined not to lose it. I am a wanted fugitive, Beatrice said quietly. Even if we both survive this, even if the Cutter Gang is stopped, I am still running from a murder charge in Philadelphia. There is no future in that. There is, if Ethan clears your name. And knowing him, he is probably already working on that, along with everything else. Sarah stood up, smoothing her skirts. Come inside and get some sleep, Beatrice. Tomorrow will come whether we are ready for it or not, and I would rather face it rested. But tomorrow came early, and it came with gunfire. Beatrice woke to the sound of shouting and the sharp crack of rifles, and for a moment she was back in the canyon watching the stagecoach driver die. Then reality crashed over her and she realized the gunfire was here, now, at the ranch. She scrambled out of bed, not bothering to change out of her nightgown, and ran to the window. In the pale light of dawn, she could see riders approaching the ranch, at least 6 of them, firing at the house as they came. Daniel was already outside, taking cover behind a water trough and returning fire with his rifle. Sarah appeared in Beatrice's doorway, her face pale but determined, carrying a shotgun that looked almost comically large in her hands. "They found us," Sarah said unnecessarily. "Daniel needs help holding them off until we can get to the root cellar. Can you shoot?" "I do not know," Beatrice admitted, because she had never held a gun before in her life. "Then you are about to learn." Sarah thrust the shotgun into Beatrice's hands and grabbed a rifle for herself. "Come on!" The next 15 minutes were chaos. Beatrice followed Sarah through the house to a window that faced the barn, where 2 of the riders were trying to circle around behind Daniel. Sarah fired twice, forcing them back, and then showed Beatrice how to aim the shotgun and pull the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked Beatrice over, but the blast was enough to make the riders think twice about their approach. "How did they find us?" Beatrice shouted over the gunfire. "Does it matter?" Sarah shot back, reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. "They are here now, and we have to deal with it." One of the riders broke free from the group and charged directly at the house, firing his revolver wildly. Daniel's rifle cracked from near the water trough, and the rider tumbled from his horse, hitting the ground hard and not moving. The other riders pulled back, regrouping near the tree line, and for a moment there was a lull in the gunfire. "We need to get to the root cellar," Daniel shouted from outside. "They are going to try to burn us out if they cannot shoot us out." As if his words had summoned it into being, one of the riders produced a torch and lit it, the flames bright in the gray dawn light. He kicked his horse forward, clearly intending to throw the torch onto the house's roof, and Beatrice felt her heart stop. Then a new sound entered the chaos, the thunder of more horses approaching at a gallop. The riders turned, confused, and Beatrice saw Ethan burst over the ridge with 3 other men beside him, all of them firing as they rode. The rider with the torch dropped it, his horse rearing in panic, and the gang scattered under the sudden assault. What followed was a fierce, brutal fight that seemed to last forever, but probably took less than 5 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the gang members were dead, 2 were wounded and disarmed, and the last had escaped back into the hills. Ethan dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his eyes searching the house desperately until he found Beatrice standing in the doorway with the shotgun still clutched in her shaking hands. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head, his heart hammering against her ear. "Are you hurt? Beatrice, are you hurt?" "No," she managed, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I am not hurt. Sarah and Daniel, they protected me." "Jesus Christ," Ethan breathed, and she felt him shudder. "I thought I would be too late. I thought—" He did not finish the sentence, just held her tighter. One of the men who had ridden in with Ethan cleared his throat pointedly, and Ethan reluctantly released Beatrice, though he kept one hand on her arm, as if he could not quite bear to let her go completely. The man was older than Ethan, with a gray beard and a star pinned to his vest that read, U.S. Marshal. "Deputy Dalton," the marshal said, and there was approval in his voice despite the chaos around them. "Good timing. A few minutes later, and this would have gone very differently." "How did they find us?" Ethan asked, echoing Beatrice's earlier question. "Jackson Pierce must have followed you when you brought Miss Jensen here. He was smarter than we gave him credit for." The marshal looked at the bodies in the yard, his expression grim. "We have been tracking the Cutter gang for months, but they have always stayed one step ahead. Until yesterday, when Pierce and another gang member showed up in Marysvale asking about Miss Jensen again. We set a trap, caught Pierce, and he talked in exchange for a lighter sentence. Told us everything, including the fact that they planned to raid this ranch at dawn. They wanted me because of Jonathan Blackwell," Beatrice said, finding her voice despite the shock. "He was laundering money for them, was he not? And they think I know where his records are, or his money, or something else they need." The marshal's eyebrows rose. "That is very astute, Miss Jensen. Yes, according to Pierce, Blackwell was supposed to deliver a large sum of money to the gang as payment for services rendered. But he died before he could complete the transaction. The gang has been looking for anyone who might know where that money is, and when they saw your wanted poster circulating, they assumed you had killed Blackwell for his money and taken it with you when you ran." "I do not have any money," Beatrice said. I barely had enough to buy a stagecoach ticket west. We know that now, but they did not, and that desperation made them sloppy. The marshal gestured to the captured gang members, who were being tied up by the other deputies. With Pierce's testimony and these men in custody, we can finally take down the rest of the Cutter gang. It is over, Miss Jensen. You are safe. Beatrice felt the words wash over her, felt the weight of the last weeks lift slightly from her shoulders. But there was still one more thing, one more obstacle between her and anything resembling freedom. I am still wanted for murder in Philadelphia. About that, Ethan said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up at him sharply. I sent a telegram to the Philadelphia police 2 days ago, asking for more information about the Blackwell case. They responded yesterday with some interesting news. It seems Jonathan Blackwell's business partner came forward after your disappearance and provided evidence that Blackwell had been involved in illegal activities, including extortion and assault of several women in his employ. The partner felt guilty about staying silent, especially after you ran. The authorities back east have been looking for you, Miss Jensen, but not to arrest you. They want you to testify against Blackwell's associates. Beatrice stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. They want me to testify, not hang? Self-defense, Ethan said gently. The partner corroborated your story, even though he had never heard it directly. He said Blackwell had a history of violence toward women, and that he was not surprised something like that had finally happened. The wanted poster was issued before all the facts came out. Once they realized their mistake, they changed it to a request for information on your whereabouts. You knew this yesterday, Beatrice said slowly. You knew I was not wanted for murder anymore, and you did not tell me. I knew Jackson Pierce was out there, and that he did not know you were cleared. I knew the Cutter gang was still a threat regardless of what Philadelphia said. I wanted to wait until it was truly safe before I told you, before I gave you hope that might still be taken away. Ethan's hand tightened on her arm. I am sorry. I should have told you immediately. Beatrice felt tears burning behind her eyes, felt something break loose in her chest that she had been holding tight since the night she ran from Philadelphia. She was not a murderer. She was not a fugitive. She was free, or as free as anyone could be in 1882, with a past that could not be erased, but might at least be forgiven. What happens now? She asked, looking between Ethan and the marshal. Now we clean up this mess, the marshal said. We take the survivors into custody, we finish rounding up the Cutter gang, and we send a telegram back east letting them know you have been found. If you are willing to return to Philadelphia to testify, the authorities there will cover your travel expenses and guarantee your safety. If you are not willing, well, I suspect they will understand given what you have been through. And if I want to go to California? Beatrice asked. If I want to start over like I originally planned? Then you go to California, Ethan said quietly. No one can stop you. You are free, Beatrice. She looked at him, at this man who had saved her life and trusted her when he had no reason to, who had risked his career and his safety to protect her, and she felt her heart make a decision that her head had not quite caught up to yet. I need to talk to Ethan alone, she said to the marshal, if that is all right. The marshal smiled, a knowing expression that suggested he understood more than he was saying. Take all the time you need, Miss Jensen. We will be here for a while dealing with the cleanup. Ethan led her away from the house, past the barn where Daniel was already assessing the damage, to a small grove of cottonwood trees that overlooked the valley. The sun had risen fully now, burning away the last shadows of dawn, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. They stood together in silence for a long moment, and Beatrice tried to find the words for what she wanted to say. You saved my life, she finally said, multiple times over the past week. I do not know how to repay that. You do not owe me anything, Beatrice. I was doing my job. Is that all it was? Your job? She turned to face him, searching his face for the answer she hoped to find. Because it felt like more than that to me. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he looked away, out over the valley. It was more than that. It has been more than that, since the moment I helped you out from behind that overturned stagecoach, and you looked at me like I was not a badge but a person. But that does not change the fact that you have a life waiting for you in California, and I have responsibilities here. What if I do not want the life I planned anymore? Beatrice asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. What if I want something different, something here? You have been through hell, Beatrice. You are not thinking clearly. I am thinking more clearly than I have in years, that she countered. I spent 2 years working for a man who saw me as property, not a person. I spent weeks running from a crime I did not commit, always looking over my shoulder, never feeling safe. And then you came along and you made me feel like I was worth protecting, like I was worth trusting, like I was worth something more than just survival. She took a breath, steadying herself. I know it has only been a week. I know this is fast and probably foolish. But when I thought those outlaws were going to burn down that house with me inside it, all I could think about was that I did not want to die without telling you that I have feelings for you, Ethan Dalton. Real feelings that have nothing to do with gratitude or fear or circumstances. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then Ethan turned back to her, and his eyes were no longer storm clouds, but something brighter, something full of hope and heat and a vulnerability that took her breath away. I have been halfway in love with you since you told me you were a school teacher with private business in California, he said roughly. And I have been all the way in love with you since you looked at that wanted poster and told me the truth about what happened in Philadelphia. You could have lied. You could have let me believe you were innocent in every way. But you trusted me with your truth, and that meant more to me than I knew how to say. Then say it now, Beatrice whispered. Ethan closed the distance between them in one step and kissed her, his hands framing her face, his touch gentle despite the intensity behind it. Beatrice kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her fear and relief and hope and love into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he said, and it was not quite a plea, but close. Not just for me, though God knows I want you to stay for me, but stay because you want to build something here, because you want a fresh start somewhere that actually feels like home. Stay because Marysvale needs a school teacher, and Daniel and Sarah need help with the ranch during cattle season, and Martha Calloway needs someone to keep her company in that boarding house. Stay because this place could use more women like you, women who are strong enough to survive hell and still come out believing in something better. I have a sister in San Francisco, Beatrice said, because she had to be honest with him about everything now. I told her I was coming. She will be worried if I do not arrive. Then we will send her a telegram explaining what happened. And when things settle down here, we will go visit her together so she knows you are safe and happy. Ethan pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. I am not asking you to give up your family, Beatrice. I am asking you to let me be part of it. Beatrice felt the tears finally spill over, hot tracks down her cheeks that Ethan wiped away with his thumbs. I do not even know if I can be a good rancher's wife. I have spent my whole life in cities. I am not a rancher. I am a deputy marshal. And someday, if I am lucky and I work hard enough, I might be a full marshal. Ethan smiled, and it transformed his face from serious to boyish. But I am not asking you to be anyone other than who you are, Beatrice. If you want to teach school, teach school. If you want to help Sarah with the ranch, do that. If you want to start a library or run for mayor or do anything else you can dream up, I will support you. All I ask is that you let me love you while you do it. That is a lot of pressure for a woman who has only known you for a week, Beatrice said, but she was smiling through her tears. Then take more time. Take all the time you need. I am not going anywhere, and neither is Marysvale. Ethan kissed her forehead, soft and sweet. But I need to know, Beatrice Jensen. If time were not an issue, if you could see into the future and know everything would work out, what would you want? Beatrice thought about Philadelphia, about running and hiding and fear. She thought about California, about her sister, and the new start she had been promised. And she thought about this moment, standing in a grove of cottonwood trees with a man who had fought for her when he did not have to, who had believed in her when no one else did, who was offering her not just safety, but love. I would want this, she said simply. I would want you. I would want Marysvale and Martha Calloway and Claire Henderson and Sarah and Daniel and this ranch. I would want to wake up every morning knowing I do not have to run anymore, that I can just be Beatrice Jensen, school teacher and survivor and woman in love with a deputy marshal who wears a tarnished badge and has eyes like storm clouds. Ethan kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, full of promise and possibility. And when they finally returned to the ranch hand in hand, Daniel took one look at them and started laughing. Ma would be so proud, he said again, and this time Ethan did not tell him to shut up. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. The Cutter gang was rounded up and brought to justice, with Jackson Pierce's testimony proving invaluable in closing dozens of unsolved cases across the territory. The marshal praised Ethan's work and hinted at a promotion that might be coming his way if he kept up the good work. And Beatrice sent a long telegram to her sister in San Francisco, explaining everything that had happened and promising to visit soon, but also explaining that she had found a reason to stay in Utah for a while longer. Her sister's response was supportive and only slightly teasing. "If he has made you happy, then I am happy for you, but I expect to meet this deputy marshal soon to make sure he is worthy of my little sister." Beatrice moved out of Martha Calloway's boarding house and into a small cabin on the edge of Marysvale that the town council had been using for storage. With help from Martha, Claire, Sarah, and half the women in town, she turned it into a home, complete with bookshelves and a writing desk and a kitchen that actually had a working stove. She also started teaching school 3 days a week, working with the handful of children in town who had been getting their education haphazardly from whoever had time to spare. And she spent her evenings with Ethan, walking through town or sitting on her small porch or riding out to the ranch to have supper with Daniel and Sarah. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and hopes and habits. Ethan told her about growing up on the ranch, about the day his father died and how it had changed everything, about the weight of the badge and the satisfaction of making things right. Beatrice told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about her sister leaving for California and how alone she had felt afterward, about Jonathan Blackwell and the night she had defended herself and the fear that had chased her west. They also did not talk sometimes, just sat together in comfortable silence, and Beatrice learned that love was not just about grand gestures and passionate declarations. It was also about the quiet moments, the shared glances, the way Ethan always made sure her coffee had the right amount of sugar, and the way she always remembered to check if he had eaten lunch when he got too focused on his work. 3 months after the raid on the ranch, Ethan rode out to Beatrice's cabin on a Sunday afternoon with a nervous energy that was entirely unlike him. She was grading papers at her kitchen table when he arrived, and she looked up in surprise as he dismounted and came inside, without even bothering to knock, which was also unlike him. "I need to ask you something," he said without preamble, "and I need you to be completely honest with me, even if the answer is not what I want to hear." Beatrice set down her pencil, her heart suddenly racing. "All right. Are you happy here, in Marysvale, with me, with this life?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, that gesture of frustration she had learned to recognize. "Because if you are not, if this is just you settling for what is safe instead of what you really want, then I need to know now before I make a complete fool of myself." "Ethan Dalton, I have never been happier in my entire life," Beatrice said firmly. "And if you think I am the kind of woman who settles for anything, then you have not been paying attention for the last 3 months. "Good," Ethan said, and pulled a small box from his pocket. "Then will you marry me?" Beatrice stared at the box, at the ring inside it that was simple and beautiful and perfect, at the man holding it with hope and fear and love written all over his face. She thought about every choice that had brought her to this moment, every twist of fate and desperate decision, every moment of terror and triumph, and she thought about the future stretching ahead of her, full of possibility and promise. "Yes," she said, and launched herself into his arms. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 2 months later in the small church in Marysvale, with what felt like the entire town in attendance. Martha Calloway cried through the whole ceremony. Claire Henderson declared it the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. Daniel stood as Ethan's best man and gave a speech at the reception that was equal parts embarrassing and heartfelt. And Sarah caught the bouquet, much to Daniel's delight and her own surprise. But the most important moment, the one Beatrice would remember for the rest of her life, came during the ceremony itself, when the minister asked if anyone objected to the marriage. Into the silence that followed, a rough voice from the back of the church called out, "She is surrounded by outlaws," they said. Beatrice's heart stopped, and she felt Ethan tense beside her. But then she recognized the voice and turned to see Jackson Pierce standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 deputies and wearing handcuffs. He was thinner than she remembered, with shadows under his eyes and a weariness that went bone deep. "The cowboy whispered," Pierce continued, his voice carrying through the shocked silence. "Then so am I now." He looked directly at Beatrice, and there was something like regret in his expression. I wanted to apologize, Miss Jensen, before they transfer me to the territorial prison. You did not deserve what we put you through, and I am glad you found someone who can keep you safe, even if that someone is wearing a badge. One of the deputies started to drag Pierce away, but Ethan held up a hand. Wait. He looked at the marshal who had come to Marysvale specifically for the wedding. Can you give him 5 minutes? The marshal considered, then nodded. 5 minutes, no more. Ethan walked down the aisle to stand in front of Pierce, and Beatrice followed because this was her life too now, her choices to make. Up close, Pierce looked even more worn down, a man who had chosen the wrong path and was finally facing the consequences. Why did you come here? Ethan asked quietly. You could have said nothing and gone to prison without anyone knowing you had regrets. Because I needed her to know that not everyone who crosses her path is going to try to hurt her, Pierce said. And because I needed to see for myself that she ended up somewhere better than where we found her. He looked at Beatrice again. I am sorry for my part in all of it. I hope you have a good life, Miss Jensen. Or I suppose it is Mrs. Dalton now. It is, Beatrice said, and found that she meant what she said next. I hope you find some peace, Mr. Pierce, wherever you end up. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even if it comes late. Pierce's eyes widened slightly, and then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his face into something almost human. Thank you, madam. That means more than you know. The deputies led him away after that, and the wedding continued with the minister, picking up where he had left off. But Beatrice felt something settle in her chest as she and Ethan exchanged their vows, something that felt like closure and new beginnings all at once. She had been surrounded by outlaws, it was true, but she had also been surrounded by friends and family and love, and that had made all the difference. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. Ethan continued his work as a deputy marshal, eventually earning the promotion to full marshal that he had worked so hard for. Beatrice continued teaching and became known throughout the territory for her dedication to education and her ability to make even the most reluctant students excited about learning. They built a life together in Marysvale, buying a proper house with room for a family and a garden and all the books Beatrice could ever want. Their first child was a son, born on a cold January night in 1884, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. They named him Thomas, after Ethan's father, and he grew up running wild through the Utah foothills and learning to ride before he could properly walk. Their second child was a daughter born 2 years later, with her mother's honey blonde hair and her father's storm cloud eyes. They named her Grace, and she was as fierce and independent as her mother had been at that age. And through it all, through the challenges of raising children and building careers and making a life in the untamed West, Ethan and Beatrice held on to each other. They argued sometimes, as all couples do, about money and children and whose turn it was to fix the leaky roof. But they also laughed together, dreamed together, built something together that was stronger than either of them could have built alone. Beatrice's sister Margaret eventually did come to visit, bringing her own husband and 2 children to meet the family in Marysvale. The reunion was tearful and joyful, and Margaret declared that she approved of Ethan wholeheartedly, especially after he spent an entire afternoon patiently teaching her eldest son how to rope a fence post. You have done well for yourself, Bea, Margaret said on the last night of her visit, using the childhood nickname Beatrice had not heard in years. When I got your telegram saying you were staying in Utah, I was worried, but now I can see you are exactly where you are supposed to be. It is strange how life works out, Beatrice replied, watching Ethan play with the children in the yard, his laughter carrying on the evening breeze. 6 years ago, I was running for my life, convinced I would never be safe or happy again. And now I have this. Now you have everything, Margaret corrected. Love, family, purpose, home. That is what matters, Bea. Not where you end up, but who you end up with. Years turned into decades, and Marysvale grew from a small frontier town into a proper community, with a school building, a larger church, and even a small library that Beatrice had campaigned for and helped establish. The territory changed around them, becoming safer and more civilized as the lawless days of the early 1880s gave way to the more settled 1890s and beyond. Ethan eventually retired from his marshal duties and took a position as the town's sheriff, a less dangerous job that meant he could spend more time with his family. Thomas and Grace grew up and started families of their own, giving Ethan and Beatrice a house full of grandchildren who called them Grandma and Grandpa, and filled their lives with noise and chaos and unconditional love. The house that had once seemed too big for just the two of them became the heart of the family, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations and quiet Sunday dinners. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Beatrice with a trip to San Francisco to visit Margaret, who was now a grandmother herself and still as vivacious as ever. They stayed for 2 weeks, exploring the city and reconnecting with family, but by the end of the visit, Beatrice was ready to go home to Marysvale. "I never thought I would say this," she told Ethan as they sat on the train heading back to Utah, "but I actually prefer the quiet of small town life now. The city is exciting, but it does not feel like home anymore. That is because home is not a place," Ethan said, taking her hand and threading his fingers through hers. "It is wherever we are together." Beatrice looked at this man who had saved her life all those years ago, who had chosen to believe in her when no one else did, who had built a life with her that was richer and fuller than anything she could have imagined. His hair was more silver than dark now, and there were lines around his eyes that came from years of laughter and worry and time. But those storm cloud eyes still looked at her with the same love and intensity they had held on that first day in the canyon. "I love you, Ethan Dalton," she said, the words as true now as they had been 30 years ago. "Thank you for saving me." "I think we saved each other," Ethan replied, and kissed her right there on the train while the Utah landscape rolled past the windows, beautiful and wild in theirs. They lived many more years together, watching their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren arrive. They saw the turn of the century together, marveling at the changes that had transformed the Utah Territory into the state of Utah, that had brought electricity and telephones and automobiles to Marysvale. They told their story to anyone who would listen about the stagecoach attack and the Cutter Gang and the choice that had changed everything. And when Ethan finally passed away in his sleep at the age of 81, surrounded by family in the house they had built together, Beatrice held his hand and whispered the words that had become their private motto, the reminder of how they had found each other. She was surrounded by outlaws, they said, and the cowboy whispered, "Then so am I now." Beatrice followed him 5 years later, passing peacefully in her garden on a warm summer afternoon, with her grandchildren playing nearby and flowers blooming all around her. They buried her next to Ethan in the Marysvale Cemetery, under a headstone that bore both their names and a single line of inscription chosen by their children. Together, they turned survival into love. The story of the schoolteacher and the deputy marshal became local legend, passed down through generations of Marysvale families. Young couples would visit their graves and leave wildflowers, hoping that some of that legendary love would rub off on their own relationships. Children would beg their grandparents to tell them about the outlaws and the canyon and the dramatic rescue, and the town itself held onto the memory of Beatrice and Ethan as a reminder that sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the best outcomes, if you are brave enough to choose love over fear. The little cabin where Beatrice had first lived as a teacher eventually became a museum, preserved by the Historical Society and filled with artifacts from her life. Her teaching notes, her wedding dress, Ethan's tarnished marshal badge, the wanted poster that had started it all. Visitors would walk through the small rooms and try to imagine what it must have been like to be a woman alone in the Wild West, to find love in the midst of danger, to build something lasting out of chaos and chance. But the real legacy of Beatrice and Ethan Dalton was not in the museum or the stories, or even the descendants who carried their names and their values forward. It was in the choice they had made, again and again throughout their lives, to see each other not as rescue and rescued, not as lawman and fugitive, not as any of the roles that circumstances had thrust upon them, but simply as two people who had found each other when they needed it most, and had refused to let go. In the end, that was the true story worth telling. Not about outlaws or wanted posters or daring rescues, though those elements were certainly dramatic enough, but about two people who had looked at each other across a canyon road in September of 1882 and recognized something worth fighting for, something worth building a life around, something worth everything, and they had been right.